Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May 16th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. We have a lot to go over today. I say that even before I consider whether we do or not, but it's usually true. So let's just stick with it. We're going to mix up the agenda a bit. It's New York Blockchain Week. People are busy and on panels and running to and fro. And in light of that, Stephen won't be joining us today. He's on a panel right now, I believe. We're going to skip the thought of the week and move immediately into my section. Then we'll talk about risk for a bit. And we have a special guest today. Matthew Rabinowitz is going to give us a recap of his weekly thoughts about the system. And we'll also hear from Vishesh, and then Cyrus will set some context for us. As always, if you have a question, please type it in the chat on the side, and we'll read it out when we get a chance. If you have access to a microphone, please use it and just jump in and ask away. We're happy to be interrupted. Also, we have a very important discussion thread that goes along with these calls. The general context here is that we have 1 hour to discuss a lot of really important topics. 1 hour isn't enough. So the idea here is that we set some base assumptions, we have some interesting debates, we surface a few ideas, and then we continue this longer discussion in the subreddits, and then act on them from there and or bring the results back to these calls. So please, if you have questions you feel that aren't going to get addressed or should be dealt or looked into more deeply, click on that link to the subreddit and ask the question there, and we'll get into it over the course of the week. All right, so I want to talk about some things today that are largely related to voting. And we had some interesting drama with the voting infrastructure over the last couple of weeks. There was an exploit discovered in the contracts. We updated the contracts. We've migrated to a new back end that has the same feature sets, feature parity with the old contract with the function removed. But in order to make that happen, we had to get people out of the old contract and into the new contract. That was a hiccup because voter apathy is something that we've been dealing with since launch. We had begun to gain some good momentum, getting people back into the system and voting with their maker. That interruption to the contract, and with everybody being in New York this week, voter apathy is now reared its head. And I want to point out something which I think is fascinating, but also equally alarming. That up until maybe sometime in the last 10 hours, we were about to be introduced to a stability fee that had been set for us by a single, admittedly drunk user that's in our chat, and that was going to be the face of MakerDAO for the next the stability fee for the next week. And so I want that to kind of sink in for a bit, because we have a lot of talks about securing the system and the importance of signaling and putting your maker into the voting portal to ensure that people's will is being heard, and because of the interruptions that I discussed earlier, participation was down. And if you're interested in following the chat for this troll, you can join us in chat.makerdao. But we were in a situation where literally one person was going to set the stability fee for all of us. Happily, somebody came in the last 10 hours or so and deposited another chunk of maker into the 2% decrease option. And so this is a slightly better situation, but in my books, not much better, because now we're in a situation where two people have decided what the stability fee is. And that raises a lot of questions at this point. Is that engagement low because people believe that these large maker holders they know better than they do, and they choose not to participate? Is it because they believe that there's too much friction in the system and they just can't be bothered? Do they believe that the amount of maker that they hold is not going to move the needle, and therefore it's a waste of time? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered here. And so this is where I want to get into the myths and misconceptions part of the talk right now, because we have a lot. Governance is hard in general. It's a capital H hard problem, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the crypto space or whether you're in the geopolitical space, the real world space. It's a very, very hard problem. And the way that voting systems have evolved over time, sort of this brute force, best effort kind of solution, which actually works. So people walk to a location, they show some ID that proves they are who they are, they go into a little booth, and there's a reason why there's curtains around those booths, and they drop a piece of paper into a box, and then other humans read those pieces of paper. It sounds ridiculous, but there's a reason why representative voting systems look like that, which is a long discussion we probably shouldn't go into today. MakerDAO is not a representative voting system. It's not a representative democracy. It's more akin to a shareholder vote in a publicly traded company. And that is a very well understood mechanism as well. People already know how that works. There's expectations and paradigms that go along with that. One of the challenges that we have in this space is that people are still confused by the word vote. And we have a lot of people that are engaged in the system that may not be familiar with the traditional business world. And so they think, okay, I have a vote. That means that it's one person, one vote. And we should all be equally able to move the system in the direction that we want. And it's important for people to realize that that's fundamentally not the way that the system was designed. It's specifically designed to not be like that. So the way that the system, the risk parameters the way that the risk parameters work in this ecosystem is designed by people with the most skin in the game, getting out, staking their maker, and making the will understood. And if people don't do that, then we have problems. So here's some memes and misconceptions that I want to talk about very briefly, because I have a tendency to speechify, and I don't know whether anybody actually listens to me when I do this stuff. One of the things I want to point out is that we have 50,000-ish MKR staked in the 2% reduction option in the poll today. That sounds like a lot of maker. It is a lot of maker, but it's absolutely inconsequential when you look at the rest of the circulating maker that is available to be used to vote. It's fantastically low. There is more than enough circulating MKR right now to easily swamp the two people that did choose to vote. And so it's not, we have a tendency to worry about plutocracies and whales in this space, and those are very valid concerns, but we need to make sure that we understand what the definition of a whale is. In some contexts, a whale is somebody that owns so much of a token that there's literally nothing anybody can do about it. There's some other projects in the space recently that have run into this problem where somebody who owns, I can't remember what it is, 46% of all the outstanding tokens has come in and just sort of had their way with another project. We're not in that spot. There's nobody in our ecosystem that owns so much maker that 5 or 6 other holders can't overwhelm that vote. So we have large holders, but we don't have whales that are capable of manipulating the system right now. So if people are sitting out and letting those large holders set policy, then it's more of a choice than an unavoidable outcome. So the message here is that we desperately need everybody to lock up their maker. If well, we don't need to break down numbers. There's people here that are, I'm willing to bet everybody here is better at math than I am, but it doesn't take a lot for a lot of voters to come out and outweigh the 1700 17K maker troll that was trying to raise the stability fee by 4% for a couple of days ago. So people need to get out to vote. There's lots of people out there. It's easy for us to do, and it just takes a couple of clicks to regain control of the system. And here's a pull quote for everybody, and I want this to kind of sink in, because this is an example. I alluded earlier that there's problems in voting structures, and those problems are universal, and they've been around since the dawn of time. And the core of that problem is that if you're a person who thinks that your vote doesn't matter in this system, then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people who do believe that their vote their vote does matter because they're actually voting. And so if people stay on the sidelines because they think that they can't move the needle, people that believe they can move the needle will control the system. So this is a commons issue that is universal, but we need to solve this problem with communication and organization and campaigning. And it's the community that really needs to help us out on this, because we need to be as agnostic as we possibly can from the foundation. But if community members believe that they very strongly believe that the vote should head in direction X, then the community needs to self-organize and begin to campaign for X, and to organize delegate systems for X, or sub-DAOs that collect votes for X. There's a lot of ways that the voting system can be optimized, but we're reluctant to make the system more complex than it already is, because we're running into a situation where we have this friction. We have basically a 2 or 3 click voting process, but we already have friction where people aren't engaging. And so if we add thresholding and delegating and liquidity, or liquid democracy, or holography, or any of the other future keys, futar keys, I don't know how to say that out loud. But if we add any one of these enormously complex mechanisms on top of it, we're going to be increasing friction exponentially, and then we're going to see increasing drop off. So if the system needs to be moved, then we're looking to the community to come up with ways to move it in the way that they want to see it moved. All right, I'm going to wrap this up, speed this up a bit. One of the memes that we need to address in the wider community is that maker holders are increasing the stability fee in order to line their own pockets. And this one is particularly annoying to me because it's fundamentally untrue and empirically provably untrue, because all you have to do is overlay a stability fee on the price of MKR over the last 2 or 3 months to see that every time the stability fee goes up, Maker generally goes down. And so this is, for me, one of the most heartwarming stories of MakerDAO recently, is that we have a series of the most highly engaged stakeholders with the most skin in the game choosing long-term success of the project over short-term gain. And that's something that we need to ensure that people understand, that nobody immediately makes money when the stability fee goes up. The next meme that I want to address, or more of a reminder, is that with this voting system, we look for 2 different signals. There's the signal of the most stake MKR staked. Yeah, that's what sets the direction of these executives, and that's what determines the stability fees. But there's a secondary signal that is extremely important to us, and that is the voter turnout. We need to know as a group whether 2 people or 2 large holders have pushed this poll forward. But in another option, there was a vastly higher number of smaller voters that didn't acquire the weight to prioritize that selection. So we need to know if there's a disconnect between turnouts and will of the larger voters. And the only way we can get that is if people actually engage with the system. Let's see, what else did I want to get into today? I think that we'll probably cut it off there. Just as a general overarching theme, it's very important for people to re-engage with the voting portal. Stake your maker and make sure that you follow the calls and look at the discussion threads, look at Vishesh's graphs, and make sure that your will is heard in the system, because otherwise drunken trolls from chat will determine your fate, and nobody wants that. All right, Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you at this point. Sorry, David, was that just a side chat, or did people have questions for me?
Yeah, it was just a side chat, and Mateo Leibowitz posted a pretty interesting link to CoinFund's governance model that assigns weighting to different tiers of token amounts.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty interesting, non-complex suggestion to a modification to our governance system.
Yeah, I'd be happy to spend like a minute or 2 talking about this if people are interested, because we had another post in the subreddit that suggested finding the average between the 2 largest options, or finding a median, I guess, in the polls. My concern there is that, I don't know if I have a concern. It feels a bit weird to me that perhaps we have one person, let's simplify the model, one person votes 1,001 for a -4, one person votes 1,001 for a +4, is 0. midpoint, or is that an option that nobody prefers?
I think
So
I think there's all different ways of doing it, right? Like getting rid of the outliers and then running some function on the remaining votes to come up. I mean, I'm sure there's ways to come up with robust estimates.
I'd love to have those discussions, but it comes back to something that I think that people might feel is a bit simplistic, and maybe on the surface makes it appear that I'm missing the point here. But one of the things I want to reiterate, we're in a very complex space. We have a lot of really cool ideas. This is crypto, so we're going to reinvent and engineer our way out of every problem that human nature has ever had. That sounds awesome, and let's give it our best. But there's some significant issues involved with complexity, and if we have a polling system, and that polling system requires people to read a page and a half of documentation and algorithms to understand how that works. I have concerns about the success of an operation like that. People don't like to read. They don't like to engage in systems. They don't like to stake their tokens. And the necessity of us trying to explain to them that, okay, you voted for X, but because you're A, B, and C, and the person that voted for Y is an X, Y, and Z, explain to them why their vote is worth less and or more depending on circumstances. And it's going to be a significant hurdle.
The other problem with all that is that depending what system you use, if it's not just pure coin vote, then people can always split their coins at multiple addresses. There's all those different ways to cheat.
Yeah, precisely. That's a great point, Josh, because it ultimately comes down to civil protection in these things. And almost every solution to the problem of governance has to do with let's somehow get its identity onto the blockchain, or the other solution is actually I just lost it. There's two. Oh yeah, sorry. Let's get identity onto the blockchain. That makes everything easier, but that's a huge problem in itself. Or let's incentivize people to vote, and that's a huge problem as well. Because as far as I'm aware, and I say this a few times, but I'd love for somebody to correct me. There is no robust and ironclad identity solution on. I know that there's some really great ones, and I'm a fan of some of them, but I'm not unaware of a rock solid identity solution on the blockchain, and I am completely unaware of any incentivization model that's ever been applied to a voting mechanism that hasn't been immediately and disastrously exploited for gain. So, but that's not me shutting down the conversation. I'm actually asking. So if anybody does know of an incentivization model for voting, I would dearly love to hear about it.
Do you have like a target for how much MKR you want to see being voted, or what kind of distribution of users or account addresses that are voting?
Well, this is where I have a tendency to, I don't want to say things too outlandish, because Christine is here and she's going to do a pull quote, but I don't necessarily think that plutocracies are a bad thing for layer 2 or layer 3. This is an application, right? It's skin in the game. These are highly engaged stakeholders. At the protocol level, I think it's an absolute disaster. But as far as what I would like personally, I think it would be nice if we had enough of a distribution in the voting system that, I don't know, 60-70% of the people that turn out have more MKR than the 30% of the largest holders, possibly. So we know that this isn't just a ship being steered by 2 or 3 accounts. If we knew that there was enough people agreeing and or being able to outweigh the top 5 holders or something, I think would be a healthy place to be in.
I think the point is, as long as the incentives are aligned, then plutocracy is okay, because they're the ones that are going to lose the most money for a bad vote. Otherwise, if plutocracy is not okay because of the incentives, then you have to go identity.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a great point, because this is why I said earlier that I found it so heartwarming that people have increased the fee, and I know that a lot of people weren't happy with that, but that fee increase, in my opinion, stabilized or helped to increase the stability of the peg, and Maker holders in general took a haircut because of that, because they understood that their incentives align with every other actor's in the system's incentives, whether they agree and or believe it or not. We need to have a stable peg. We might find in the future that additional groups of stakeholders arise that have competing incentives, and that will be a tricky situation. But yeah, you're right, Josh. If we can agree that everybody's incentives probably align, then plutocracies are actually quite nice sometimes. Mateo, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Here, I could read it out if you want.
Another victim, sure.
Yeah, so Rune has previously, so Mateo wrote in the chat, Rune has previously stated that turnout itself is not important, as don't necessarily know whether majority is voting for the quote correct outcome. Also, I don't think we can put much weight towards individual address participation, as eventually that will just be exploited too. Yeah, that's the point Rich was making earlier. More important is that there is always sufficient voters ready to vote for emergency shutdown. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I agree with all of those points. I think that at this stage you have to start assigning numbers to some of these groups of people. So how many? Yeah, so I think in principle I agree with what Rune says.
Yeah, and that's today you're voting on the stability fee or the DSR. I mean, the question really is, as the evolution, are we voting on the stability fee, or are we going to be voting on the tuning of equations that do it for us?
Yeah, and I agree. And it also, we need to clarify too, and this is sort of a loaded term recently, but this is scientific governance, and whether you like or dislike that term, that the point is the point of it is that ultimately we need to get to a space where opinions don't matter. And so there's either empirical evidence or there's not empirical evidence that one or the other decisions are correct. And once we get into a model where we have that sort of black and white as much as possible, black and white model to look at, it's far easier to find outlying opinions that would expose themselves as being an attack on government. So if we spend a few weeks looking at these Python scripts and clean data sets and graphs that clearly state that X needs to happen, and then we have a poll where there's a large voter comes in and votes for Y, then that brings us to a situation where we can start looking for trolling and or attacks, and then have some uncomfortable conversations about what governance attacks look like at that point. But the emergency shutdown is critically important to this.
I have a quick question. I know you guys last week, I think it was, you talked about the changing state based off of the poll and the executive vote. Has that sort of been looked into or resolved, or any solutions come forward?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
I think maybe it was about cadence. Do you mean?
Oh,
like
I see.
Yeah, voting cadence.
Yeah, that's actually a great question as well. And I was going to get to it today, but I was afraid that I was talking too much, so I cut it. We have some mechanical restrictions, or there's functional restrictions in the existing voting portal right now. We have a new version that's coming out very soon. It has far more flexibility, but unfortunately right now we're in a position where we can only have one active vote at a time, and that includes polls. And that's part of the reason why the cadence looks the way it does. My hope was that we would take the breathing room that the contract update provided us last week. Then we would have a discussion about what new cadences would look like. This week, we would have a poll from Monday to Wednesday with the same old default options, or Thursday morning with the same old default options. And then immediately we would kick off another poll that would discuss, do we want to alter the cadence? Do we want to think about executives on Monday, or
So
Tuesday, Friday cadence, or Monday, Thursday cadence, or do we move to a 14-day cadence? The problem is that the voting portal right now doesn't support that mechanism. And so it's going to have to wait until, I think, 2 weeks before we can reevaluate that. Does that make sense? Did I lose you, Josh?
Well, I was just wondering, like, I'm trying to understand the problem, because last time you mentioned that changing the cadence longer isn't really a solution because it can always fail regardless how much time. So I don't really understand exactly what the issue is, like technically.
Sure. What the problem here? There's some murkiness because we're kind of talking about three different issues. One issue is the speed or the length of the cadence. Do we have a 7-day governance cycle or do we have a 14-day governance cycle? The other issue is do we start executives on a Monday and give people the business week to get their hardware wallets out of storage or deal with their custody solutions in order to engage with the system? Because right now we have executives on Friday, and presumably people have things to do on the weekend other than vote on MakerDAO issues. So there's which day we kick things off on. Another issue that we wanted to address is the range of options that we provide in these polls still valid? Because we wanted to go from a 1% increments from -4 to +4, but does it make more sense to do 2% increments and then simplify the UI a bit? The other issue that we had was around, the other issue we had is that we have a system that's designed around continuous approval voting. And what that means is that in the executive system, we have a vote that has been accepted by the maker holders that represents the state of the system. It's basically a picture of all the stability risk parameters locked in and been applied to the system. When we have a poll, people choose an option. We convert those options into a single executive vote, and then we vote on that. And here's the issue that you were addressing. So we ran into this situation where we fell into this paradigm, I guess, of assuming that as a new poll gets put into the executive system, this is new, and because it's new, it's improved, and therefore we all assume that people will be moving their maker from the old picture, the old state of the system, into the new executive. And we got lulled into that expectation because it generally took about 10 hours for people to do just that. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a situation where that didn't happen, where the new executive didn't get ratified, or maker didn't move from the old executive to the new executive all weekend. And we were in a position where we were designing or writing up the poll for the following week. And we're asking ourselves, okay, this poll is suggesting a 0 to 4% increase, but increase of what? The old stability fee represented in the old executive, or the stability fee represented in the new executive, which hasn't been ratified yet. So we can't release a poll without understanding what the state of the system is. And so the idea is that if we go to, sorry, go ahead.
So then is that not just as simple as saying that instead of having the polls go plus or minus some percent, you go an absolute value? Like, we want to be at 15%, and next week you're polling for 19%, not plus whatever, but not +4, but
yeah, so
19%.
Yeah, moving from relative to absolute values was put out there too. We still have this issue where a poll could, where an executive can be decided halfway through the length of the polling period. So if somebody says, okay, sorry, so I guess that ties back to your absolute solution. With a relative solution, we have that issue where polling could still, or executive voting could still be happening during the poll, which raises confusion. If we have absolute values, then we need to make sure that the number of options that represent those absolute values are possible depending on what the previous executive is. So
may I
encompass the entire range. Right, go ahead. Yeah.
So if we throw up an executive vote to change the stability fee, what does it look like if it doesn't pass?
Well, that's what I mean about the ambiguity. So we have this situation where I've been calling them weak executives. So we have an existing state of the system. We have a poll that provides us with a new potential state of the system, a new executive vote. The assumption is in the community that, okay, we'll just wait until the large maker holders ratify this thing, and now we know what the state of the system looks like. That's the situation we ran into during that weekend, where for whatever reason, this new executive didn't get ratified, and so it created ambiguity. We had this weak executive vying for supremacy in the system. And the assumption, we have to start asking ourselves a bunch of questions, like why did that poll succeed? Why did the new executive not get ratified? What is it about the old executive that people found more enticing? Is this just a matter of apathy or people's schedules not aligning with our voting mechanism? That we run into a situation where there's so much ambiguity, we don't know what's happening. So I don't know how to answer that question.
If I can just rephrase the question here, my question is, should there be finiteness, like a time period where the executive vote ends, to allow for it to fail, and then we know that it failed, and then it's over?
Yeah, and
can I actually speak to that? I have kind of a theory. So, like, if you see what Rich called a weak executive vote, where there's not a lot of people piling in their maker so as to overwhelm the previous hat or the previous proposal, then what you're going to see is, because the previous proposal can be overthrown by like a lower amount of MKR, people from the failing proposal will actually have to go back into the old proposal to kind of strengthen the status quo. That's kind of what I'm thinking the game theory is going to be, the more proposals come out that don't actually pass that threshold amount. So,
and I can speak to that a bit, because we tossed around a bunch of ideas about this. And so this is where we started talking about thresholding and time limits and timeouts. And so one of the ideas was we had thresholding a series of algorithms to the poll. So if it's less than X% of turnout or less than X% higher results for one option, the poll doesn't go through, and then we just don't have an executive. The other solution that was mooted for the executive was if the executive doesn't pass, if the new executive doesn't pass over the course of the next 2 or 3 days, anybody who voted for that executive just has their maker returned to the previous option. And so we sort of clean out this weak executive idea.
So I have a quick technical question, because I don't understand this about the system or about the voting. If are all executives always active? So if an old one from like 6 months ago happens to have 50,000 maker in it, and the newest one that we poll only has 49,000, does that mean that the 6-month-old one is active?
No,
it's not. So once the hat has been lifted on a previous proposal, it's you can't like reactivate a proposal once it gets surpassed.
Okay, so as
the
soon
model
as it
here
gets
to
overridden,
think about
it
is
dies.
that the executive vote is a set of configurations for a program, and that program is MakerDAO. And so we can't allow, we can't revert the settings on a system that might have been upgraded in the background. I guess is this, like, you can't apply old settings on a new system. And so there's no backwards movement here. So once the executive has been approved, you can't go back.
So this is only an issue with the most recent executive versus the newest executive. So basically, it's the problem of 1 week or one version to the next.
Exactly. I wasn't expecting so much engagement, because usually people don't care about this stuff. So I'm actually quite encouraged. We need to continue this conversation, though, because I just realized that I've just eaten up 10 minutes of risk time, which I'm not going to be happy about. If people want to continue this discussion, please click on the MakerGov Reddit subreddit link that I posted in the chat, and let's try and figure out a solution to this problem.
And at the same time, we're going to be doing the post-call discussion as well, right? It's for people that want to stay a little late.
Yeah, if you want to hang out afterwards. But before we get down another rabbit hole, Cyrus, sorry, I apologize. I'm going to hand this off to you now.
No worries. It's a good discussion. I'm actually going to just hand it straight over to Vishesh right now. I think we're going to see some interesting stuff today, given that DAI is above $1 for the first time in a while.
Yep. All right. Let me share my screen. Okay. And I will also share a link to this sheet just so everyone has it. Okay, so broad strokes, a lot has changed in the last week. I think the overarching connecting narrative here is just going to be that like we're I think seeing a lot of full circle events from a lot of the leverage behavior that's been accumulating over the past few months that we've been dealing with the DAI price peg problem. And as everybody is aware, the entire ecosystem surrounding Maker has kind of changed a bit given what's been going on with the bull market and ETH prices. So I think good to take a lot of the same things that we've been looking at, but in a different context. So as far as ETH price, yeah, I mean, ETH price has come up to and over the peg. So there's an apologies, there's a 24-hour delay on these stats, but I do have the fresh stats as well. So essentially, stability fee has kind of come up and up and up from 11.5% mid-April up to 19.5% to about 2 weeks ago. And then since then, we've held the stability fee steady, but the DAI price has sort of continued to come up. Now, it's impossible to talk about this without talking about it in the context of what's going on with ETH price. So, we had kind of seen this fairly consistent inverse relationship between what had been going on with ETH prices and what had been going on with DAI prices. And I mentioned this a bit on the previous call in terms of the ratio of short-term ETH price to long-term ETH price had been pretty well correlated to the DAI price. That had been primarily, in my opinion, as a result of kind of overall bullishness on ETH, leading to a lot of that leverage behavior. What's interesting is that it's really broken the pattern, in the past 2 weeks, given ETH price kind of skyrocketing. Now, that is also explainable, and it makes actually a ton of sense if you consider that a lot of what we've been looking at here is missing a big component, which is what is the demand for DAI and what those use cases are. Now, part of that is because it's hard to measure and track DAI demand and where exactly all that DAI is going and how it's being used. But what we've definitely measurably seen in the past, I would say 4-ish days, is just huge trading volume on DAI. And even this, has a bit of a delay. So I'll just share what's been going on in the last 24 hours. So DAI supply has come down to, it was at 85, had come down to about 80.9 million. And PETH supply has also come down a little bit further. The collateral ratio has come up 60 points in the last 24 hours or so, primarily as a function of ETH price, but this had in the intermediate range spiked up over 600 and then come back down a bit. So that tends to happen around ETH price movements. Is you'll see here the collateralization ratio will tend to spike. Just scroll down. The collateralization ratio will tend to spike and then come back down a bit because mathematically it goes up when the ETH price goes up, and then people kind of stabilize to a level they're comfortable with. Well, in the last 24 hours or so, that had shot up way over. It was at like 440, 450%. That had shot up to 600 some percent given the ETH price change, and then people were kind of comfortable with it stabilizing down around 580%, which is huge. I mean, that's a tremendous collateralization ratio. I think that is evidence of some deleveraging behavior. And this is corroborated with what's been going on with a lot of the trading volumes. In the past 24 hours or so, 15 million DAI have been traded. And if you just slid that 24-hour range back a few more hours, it was something like 20 million. So what's interesting about this is tremendous amount of DAI ETH trading volume, but usually DAI ETH trading volume is associated with a drop in DAI price. What we've seen now is DAI price skyrocketing with tremendous trading volume. So what that actually says is a lot of folks selling ETH that they had been levered up on, cashing out some of those profits in DAI terms, and then not immediately selling that DAI for US dollars, which is like an extremely positive sign for Maker, in that people, crypto people specifically, see and understand the value of DAI as kind of a temporary shelter against volatility, but also, given its stability, a good unit to sort of take those profits in. I know there's been a lot of discussion around whether that's for tax purposes or whether those people are kind of waiting to, again, lever up. And I think we can only speculate as to the reason, but definitely a positive indicator for Maker as a system. I think people are showing a lot of confidence in the system. So what we saw was, in the last 24 hours, a lot of this trading volume had happened on Oasis, ETH to DAI, but also a fair amount on Uniswap. I also bucketed out sort of at what prices these trades were happening, and how many of these trades were happening at which prices. So most of the trades have been around $1.02, $1.01, and then the volume weighted average is like $1.19. So I think overall what we're seeing is people are okay with taking a little bit of a haircut on selling ETH for DAI, in terms of doing that at like $1.02, because they're primarily cashing out on 40-50% profits on ETH, and so that tiny amount of cost for trading DAI above the peg is worth it for them. What is going to be interesting is, I know there's been a lot of discussion that, oh, DAI is above the peg, and so we should definitely reduce the stability fee. A lot of this is primarily a function of cashing out those profits and not having taken another step after doing that. I think it's going to be an important discussion about what we think people will do with that DAI and how long they will sit with that DAI. My guess is, because people have been so levered up for so long, and because fundamentally nothing other than the ETH price has economically changed in the past 2 weeks, that there's a very good chance that a portion of that DAI will then, when ETH price drops down or stabilizes a bit, get sold again for ETH. So I think we should be careful about making too many reactionary changes right now, because the most recent trend in the system over the past 4 or 5 days is not likely to just sit or hold where it is. I'm not saying it'll reverse entirely, but I think a little bit of wait and see is probably a smart strategy. So going back over to draws and wipes, so what we initially saw was, a large quantity of DAI being minted. Again, after this line ends, there was an even larger quantity of DAI burned, bringing the supply down to, almost 81 million. The circulation of debt has been outstanding recently. I mean, a large quantity of old debt had been closed out, and a large quantity of new debt has been minted. And then subsequently, a large quantity of new debt was closed out. So it was really interesting to see over the past few days, the age of debt has really significantly dropped, age of open debt. Compound, so what's been going on with some of the secondary lending markets is the rates kind of ran up a little bit, which makes sense in terms of how much DAI demand has been over the past week or so. The rates ran up and then dropped down a bit. I think this makes sense in the context of some of what's been going on with Nuo and some of the other platforms has an interesting effect on Compound, but effectively, as these secondary lending platforms become more of a primary source of DAI for people that want access to stablecoins, I think that there's been a lot of discussion about whether that helps DAI price or not, but it definitely gives people access to that DAI without changing the overall supply. So at least in terms of supply, there's a positive effect there. And then the total loan supply and borrow volumes have not changed significantly, but the rates have been fluctuating significantly. So I think there's just a lot of refinancing and people kind of changing hands, but net, the overall supply levels have stayed relatively stable. And then a lot of there have not been very many draws recently, but a lot of the draws recently have just been on pre-existing CDPs. Not a lot of new CDPs have been opened in the past 30 days or so. Yeah, so I'll kind of stop it there. I know that was long. And then if people have questions, I'm happy to double click on anything in particular.
Cool. Thanks, Vishesh. I have a ton of questions.
Do you want to dig into questions that relate specifically to that, or in this ecosystem in general? Sorry, I'm trying to get Matthew before we run out of time.
Oh, no, in general. So let's have him go first.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Matthew has been doing some really great recaps for us in the subreddit that are worth a read. I'll post a link in a second, but Matthew, I'm going to hand it off to you to set some context for us.
All right, sure. Thank you. Yeah, this is it's an iterative academic exercise. Some of it's empirical, some of it's, well, hopefully logical, but I believe it to be true, and we're on the same path as everyone, the pursuit of knowledge, and some of that just morphs over time as we engage differently and learn different points. Specifically for me, learning more about like automation, my point has totally shifted on that over time. So that said, let's just jump in. So like the stability fee, it is where it is. It's 19.5. The poll now shows it decreasing by 2%. We have seen that rally that we just talked about, and the underlying collateral base and DAI has gone up, right? There is a risk, however, of the price being squeezed. Now, the point that Vishesh brought up is a really good one of what will people do now that they're in DAI? How long will it take before they sell back into ETH? It's an excellent point. That also being said, we also probably cleared out most of the market makers' inventory. And in doing so, where the price is right now, we also take the exact chance that the price actually can elevate much higher right now in any more increases for that same reason. So for those kind of reasons, backing off the stability fee, which I only saw the poll 20 minutes ago, looks like it's going to happen, or now it'll be a vote. That's a good thing. So I guess the basis where we always start on this is that CDPs in general, for the most part, rightfully should be acting on their selfish behalf. They should always be out for their own interest. So they'll take out a loan only if they gain value from it. If the stability fee is too high economically, they'll contract their exposure. Conversely, if they can make money by taking out that loan with a lower rate or any rate, they will, all things being equal. They don't care about the system as a whole, nor really is that their objective. They're just an end user. That's the basis for where we start, the foundation of like kind of the understanding of why people would act in a certain way. So when we see the rally in ETH and the outstanding DAI rally as well, and then back down, it kind of means that the blended rate of a return of people using ETH, using the system for leverage on ETH, the blended return for those participants, if the DAI is continuing to contract, means that their return is probably really close to the stability fee, if not slightly below, because that's why the outstanding DAI is continuing to contract. So I mentioned this in some other post somewhere. It's a little bit like ski slaloming. We have to start pivoting our weight, in this case, the stability fee, earlier to try to not to overcorrect, not to have too much of that be emotions, but when we see these other empirical data points coming up, we want to make sure we try to stay on the peg, not move after the peg is moving after us. That makes sense. So following on that thought, running out of DAI inventory is a bad thing for market makers. Not too much, not too little, just the right amount. So we should lower the stability fee accordingly, and just slightly. And that looks like that's in our future. So if they truly run out of inventory, and I have to yield to market makers to comment on that, we really need to watch that, because that was, it's kind of the converse thing that Joe mentioned one time about, when you see icebergs in trading where, it looks like there's no more inventory, and then somebody just keeps putting blocks of trades in at a certain price, and it feels like it never ends. We might be at the very end of that. And if we're at the very end of that, that's a really bad thing. Now, everything I just outlined, that really only makes sense kind of in a single collateral structure. So kind of onto the future of like what I understand the DSR and multi-collateral DAI to be, and that is absolutely an educational moment for me, because I am learning, because I don't know the technical roadmap. I'm only using from what I've determined thus far. So the DSR throws much of what I just outlined out the window. It's just a critical tool for us to implement. So let's just take a moment and a shout out to everybody who designed it and wrote it and developed it, because it's going to help us. Please, everybody volunteer or do something to help make that a reality. can't happen soon enough, and it is still, quote, coming soon, right? So why is it so important? Because we're going to be establishing a direct transfer of value from the borrower to the saver. We're now going to be implementing both aspects of the core of economics, and that's that incentives work. Further, it will address the vocal few that believe that Maker has elevated rates to further enrich themselves. It provides direct evidence to contradict that thesis. All right, so in this case, we have an incentive to cost, which is the penalty, to not spend so much on interest, and an incentive to earn by saving with the DSR. Clearly, one is negative and one is positive. Each has its own elasticity and its own potency. So let me just share. I put together a very basic chart, and this is nothing like Vishesh's, so humor me. Let me know when you can see it.
We can see it now.
All right. So in my mind, this is going to be just an iterative game of how we get control of this animal and bring the overall stability fee back into a realm of usefulness for society. Right now, it's being used primarily for leverage. It's primarily for on-chain. It's primarily to make trading bots and engines money as they optimize and create efficiencies and liquidity. And all of that's useful and needed. All right, so then what? In a multi-collateral world, some of the collateral will have an end use that is going to be on-chain, but some of it will be off. Now, I struggled a long time, and I still do, with this multi-dimensional component about how some of the capital will be taken off-chain, which directly degrades the price of DAI to US dollar somewhere. So we have to have a system that's going to help adjust for that. And for me, this is where my thinking has kind of evolved into why this PID algorithms are so essential, and why they need to be implemented, not initially in a complete solution, but rather as input to this type of governance call. So it would get rid of the emotion, get rid of the naysayers, and just focuses on the empirical math. And the question also turns into what we were talking at the very beginning: is, do we have weekly voting, or does the algorithm change components of the DSR or the stability fee on a weekly basis, a daily basis? Or am I actually more of an advocate for, even at all the way down to the level of when DAI is being minted or burned? And not only, but with an aspect, right? If you're going to mint 3,000 DAI, it's very different than if you want to mint 30 million DAI. Then further, it makes a difference if you're planning to take that off-chain or on-chain, depending on, these are the risk teams that are going to hopefully include this concept of, if you're doing it for real estate, which is clearly off-chain, there will be an impact on the price. The question will just be, what will it be? If we follow this concept of having an algorithm do a PID, which is basically the same thing that cars use, autonomous cars when they are driving in a lane, or your cruise control from 30 years ago, we need to always have humans veto the output. Hence the emergency shutdown concept. How much voting we have, that's going to be a perpetual question. To me, it's much more going to turn into a voting to tune the algorithm over time, and then ultimately vote if we don't like the output. All right. So for clarity, I'm not here to tell the Maker team or anybody how to do it. This is just my thoughts, what I believe makes sense. And ignorance is really bliss, because I have no, quote, inside information on the technical roadmap. So there's always going to be a concern about how a PID system, or any system for that matter, how folks could, quote, game the system. That concern will never disappear, ever. It will, however, be able to make some folks an arbitrage profit. That's true. But then over time, other folks will figure out how to front run the initial folks to get rid of it. At some point, all of the arbitrage folks, for the most part, end up putting themselves out of business. But what they did in doing so inserted something amazing, which is efficiency and market depth, something right now we sorely need. So what is interesting is that if anyone wants to game the system, they can actually do that right now, because we are live streaming this. And for folks that want to change the stability fee, they can act accordingly, right? That they can actually take those decisions depending on how much Maker they have. So in an ironic world, we may actually want to have a PID tool and want people to game the system. It sounds counterintuitive, but it may end up helping us because we desperately need the liquidity and market depth. As for the chart, really the notion behind it was that the DSR initially, as we implement it, it is raw alpha, but it does something that's really different, where it's directly removing the die supply. So during the last 3-4 months of these calls, as we've tried to increase the stability fee to cause the reduction in supply, the DSR does it directly, just simply because of the savings aspect. In doing so, we will find, when we start off at 100 basis points, capturing that data is just essential. We will find, I don't know what the top point of the DSR will be, but it will get to the point where it will just be silly for hedge funds not to participate in just raw alpha. But once we do that, once we can control the DSR by incrementally decreasing it, then the stability fee, and going back and forth, one then the other, so we can identify the signal between the two, we'll be able to hone and pull both of them back down into a realm, what I call the sweet spot, over the next 3 to 5 years, where I can see a world where the savings rate will be basically competitive and outperform banks, and the stability fee will outperform the lending side of a bank, and the risk premium in between is basically what Maker token holders embrace.
I want to jump in with a question here, actually. Sorry, did I cut you off? Did you say that's all?
No, that's all. Thank you.
No, that's great. I have a few questions, and one of them is going to be a basic question. Can we get a refresher on PIDs?
Yeah.
So we understand what we're all talking about.
Yeah, PID stands for proportional, integrational, and derivative. Hang on a second. Actually, I think I put some links at the bottom here. I'll send this out in a little bit, but I'll share my screen on something else.
So PID is it's a control loop. So it's used in your, if you have a thermostat, it's used in thermostats, it's used in ovens, it's used in cruise control, everything.
Precisely, yeah. Ovens, thermostats, so that would be the P in PID. That's just proportional. It's really on and off. So imagine if you were in your car going down a lane and you hit, autopilot mode, and it just pinged back and forth. It would drive you crazy. No one would want to use it. But in a true PID controller, and I mean, this is raspberrypi.org, right? So this site, using an autonomous car, they have sample code on here that we can use, or anybody could use for that matter. The point is that you start using integral and derivative control to then to dampen the oscillation back to hone into the ultimate target. So for me, the ultimate target is to get back down to those 2%, 1.5% numbers that I showed on the previous PDF. And a PID would allow us to do that. The question would be just tuning it. And that is not an easy, that a working group needs to be set up, in my respectful opinion, to help start to develop this and use it on these governance calls based on the data we get, then ultimately migrate that code and tune it off chain, bring it on chain, and continue to vote on the tuning equation, the tuning variables.
Yeah, so what are you thinking about inputs? Because I think that's the hard part, is what is the error? Where's that signal coming from? Is that just price, or is that a bunch of fuzzy logic inputs?
Yeah, well, it would definitely be the die price. That's obvious. That's a no-brainer. But it would also be the amount of the die stability fee, the amount of die that's in that, the amount of die that's locked up, the amount of the current stability fee, the amount of die outstanding. I mean, those first 4 or 5, you need more than that, but that's a great place to start. I mean,
right.
Just think about right now, a car drive. I mean, the old ships used to use PID systems on how to sail, and most of those are just based on wind and where they're located. I mean, we need other inputs, but a significant portion of what we need, we have in front of us.
Right. Yeah. Like, I am a controls engineer by trade, programmer. So I've used PIDs lots. There's probably one within 20 feet of everybody in this chat right now. But basically they're used on every motor and machine. But so basically your proportional gives you your error correction. That's like a fixed multiplication amount. So if the die price is down 10 cents, then you do 10 cents times some value, which would set stability fee. The integral, I can't remember what that does exactly, but derivative is error over time. So the last 1,000 samples are basically interpreted so that you don't get a deadband, so that the stability fee isn't like fluctuating or flickering for no reason week to week because the error goes to 0 or something. So if it's at $1, you don't start dropping the stability fee.
Okay, that's great context. I actually, the reason I asked is because I wanted to. I assumed it wasn't the same thing I knew from electronics, but apparently it is. So that's good. That's good feedback. I want to touch on something that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, Matthew, about the impact that empty inventories from market makers might have when or if we see that people are going to start flooding the market with their flight to safety dye that they're collecting right now. And the general consensus seems to be, or the impression I'm getting is that that you think that there might be something bad that's going to happen then because inventories might be depleted at that point. But isn't there a counter argument that we might be looking at a more healthy price discovery system at that point, where people are actually not fighting against market makers that are looking to dump all the cheap dye that they bought in the past?
Yes and no, right? I mean, you could make the opinion. It's a good point. You could also take the view that when you have kind of an artificial amount of supply hanging out there that somebody has to buy up before you have real price discovery, we didn't have it before. And if we're getting past 1 right now, then if the price keeps going up, that means stability fee is artificially too high because we had to chew through that supply to get there.
Yeah.
So just to chime in there, I think that's a really good point, is when we're talking about like a PID style, like automated management system, then it does kind of mess up the signals and it makes it harder to tell what the true values of those inputs are, or the realized values, I would say, right? So if you have, a highly illiquid dye market, then there's kind of the dye price at which the trades are occurring, and then there's kind of a realized dye price, which is, based on a certain amount of volume that you're looking to trade, what actual price would you be able to get overall? And that's, a function not only of what the most recent dye price is, but also how liquid that dye price is. That being said, like if the goal is management of the system and, sort of clear signals, et cetera, it is good to have a more liquid market so that you truly know what's going on. But if we're just talking about dye price, it's not necessarily bad for the dye price for there to be low market maker inventory, because that illiquidity is more than anything likely to drive up the price. So it's kind of like what goal you're talking about there, but illiquidity is not necessarily a bad thing. It just makes it a little bit harder to properly fine tune those variables.
So one of your criterias in the PID could be that your market makers are at 50% on both sides. And then if they're at 75% to one side, that's part of your error. You get 25% error then, because your target's 50-50.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing for us to chat about in a Reddit area. I don't know exactly what components we would all put inside of it, because it also depends again how often does the PID algorithm run. If it's run once a week, you can make it really comprehensive and really, really thick in what code it executes. It may cost more gas, but who cares, right? If you put it down all the way at the level where dye gets minted or burned, you want to have it really light and thin, right? So I can imagine both angles being useful.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. That was great. It spawned an interesting conversation I think that we're going to be having again and again in the future. Cyrus, you mentioned before I cut you off a couple minutes or 10 minutes ago that you had some questions you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to talk about the dye price and some of the data Vishesh presented. First question is, do we know why demand for leverage has dropped despite the continuing ETH rally? And do we care to try to figure out speculator behavior? The reason I ask is because we used to fear the price rallies as being damaging for the ETH price. Back when DAI was trading like 96, 97 cents, and it seemed like we were on the cusp of a breakout in the markets, there was this urgency to raising the stability fee so that DAI is not harmed more. But now if we're just going to kind of accept that it's random, then does that mean we just kind of ignore this correlation in the future if it's going to be unpredictable anyways?
I would love to chime in on that. So this was actually a question that was raised a couple days ago in the Maker chat, but I wouldn't say it's quite random. So just because it hasn't followed the sort of simple trend that we've expected doesn't necessarily mean that it's random. What I think has happened is we don't actually know if the demand for leverage has necessarily significantly decreased, because what I think is more the explanation is there is a larger signal that is definitely outweighing that, even if it is potentially positive. And so that larger signal is just the tremendous amount of ETH DAI trading, particularly people cashing out ETH and then holding on to that DAI. Now, we have in the past, quote unquote, feared rises in ETH price because ETH price had overall, like on a long-term weighted average, been what people, I think, considered cheap. I think the point is in the short term, ETH price, and this is why I've kind of tried to look at that ratio of short to long term rather than just simply ETH price, because the point in time I don't think necessarily tells us anything. It's more about like what is the trend that people are perceiving. And so what I think is going on right now is in the short term, ETH price is very high. It is unclear what people's sort of, if you think about like GBMs and random walks and stuff like that, what people's expected, trend is over time for ETH price at this point. And that's where I don't think it is necessarily productive to guess at like what the speculators are doing or what they're thinking. But as far as explaining what has been going on, I do think that sort of selling ETH signal and cashing out on some of those profits has significantly outweighed anything that we would be able to see in terms of a depressive effect on DAI price from, even if there were, more lever seekers than in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But that's kind of the two things. One is it's kind of backward looking, right? We only know after the fact whether speculators thought ETH was cheap or not cheap. And then secondly, like, what if they're wrong? I mean, what if they think that ETH is not cheap anymore, but then ETH continues to rally up like crazy? How does that affect like the policy tools that MakerDAO voters need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And this is why it's not easy to manage monetary policy, and why I've kind of cautioned against too much like short timescale reactionary changes, because that time can be our friend in terms of helping us understand what's actually going on. But it is 100% by definition backward looking. And I think a lot of what we've been doing with DAI price is can seriously be considered backward looking, in that when ETH price or when DAI price suffers and we see ETH price going up, we draw this correlation and say that, okay, well, one is either related to the other or caused the other or whatever. Now, when we see this sort of significant jump in ETH price, we have to, I think, expand the scale of what relationships we're looking at. And so the best that I think we'll ever be able to do in terms of looking at data like that and managing a monetary policy, and actually a PID system, is to some extent backward looking by nature. The best that I think we'll be able to do in any sort of like reasonable level of effort that we can implement within the next few weeks is like looking at a better function for what's been going on with those ETH prices and how it's been related to the DAI price. And I think the key there, and we're never going to be able to like properly estimate people's perceptions, but the key there is probably going to be looking deeper into the relationship between short and long-term ETH price is my guess. But that's
Yeah.
a great answer, I know.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think we're on the same page there. Okay, so I guess slightly shifting topics. I also am curious about people's opinions on, I mean, the policy. I mean, our response to a expensive DAI price is not necessarily the same as that to a cheap DAI price, because the risk profile is very asymmetric. Soaking up excess, trying to soak up DAI from the system is very different from trying to create more of it. And obviously, right now there's about 20 million DAI room left in the debt ceiling. And I mean, technically, there's supposed to be this incentive for people to print DAI, right? If DAI is trading above $1, it's kind of like a incentive design that doesn't necessarily exist on the cheaper side. So how can we factor that in, or do we just say, I mean, if DAI price is above $1, then MKR holders should vote for a fee decrease?
Well, that's a great question too, because I think that this is something that we've been wrestling with for a while. Is whether part of the system design was CDPs using CDPs for DAI arbitrage, right? And I'm not convinced that the benefits that people can see from that outweigh benefits they can just find on the open market with their DAI or with their ETH. And so,
and this is why speculator demand for leverage is so important. If we could forecast it, because then we could forecast if we think traders or market makers will print up that remaining debt ceiling to push the DAI price down. For example, like if ETH was at $100 right now, they would probably print it and push the DAI price down. But it looks like, I mean, so far in the last 2 days, they haven't actually been doing that. DAI supply has been going down. We saw that one huge wipe a few days ago.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. I mean, I know there's been a lot of like the stupidest, simplest formula that we could use to manage monetary policy is to say if DAI is above the peg, increase or decrease the stability fee, and if DAI is below the peg, increase it. I think the whole point of why we're all spending so much time and effort trying to work on these problems is to get to better answers than that. And so, like, I think it's an extremely important point to consider that Maker is not a perfectly symmetric system. And it is much harder to bring the DAI price back up than it is to bring it down. There is a built-in arbitrage mechanism when DAI is above $1. And everyone is incentivized, I'm incentivized to draw DAI out and sell it when DAI is above $1. The only case where that is
only if you're accepting the stability fee.
But if it's, so this is where time becomes really important, is it depends on your time exposure to that stability fee, right? So it could theoretically not matter if I'm able to, with limited transaction cost, take that DAI, purchase ETH, or sorry, take that DAI, sell it for ETH, and then pay back, sell it back and pay back my debt. I could effectively just collect a simple arbitrage profit minus some transaction cost minus the time that I'm exposed to price volatility in ETH. And I think that's a really important point to consider is like, what's the liquidity of DAI? How many trades are on the order book? What's the potential that in that time period, I am exposed to significant price changes? Just to answer that question on the chat real quick, no, I've got tiny balances on everything. I'm not doing anything in any significant volume. But yeah, I mean, I think the time that you're exposed to that price volatility is a significant factor in how profitable it is to arb DAI. But overall, I think like by and large, it's going to be profitable. And so, at least for most people. And so like I do think there is a natural mechanism that is built into Maker for when DAI is above $1 to have sort of a downward price pressure. We assumed that there was going to be a similar, I think the initial like white paper assumption was there's going to be a similar natural case when DAI is below $1 for people to pay back their debts at a discount. The thing, and this is where the whole conversation has been about, is people have not necessarily been willing to do that because they were kind of holding on for some other bigger profit. And what is interesting is, and to me, this is like kind of this week is kind of a big moment for Maker, because what I see is a lot of that leverage behavior over time now kind of coming out, people cashing out on a lot of those levers and paying down a lot of that debt to really bring down the DAI supply. I think, down to 80, 81 million was a significant amount. But what is
something that I've noticed as well, and I'm trying to figure out the impact of the stability fee versus third-party lending markets versus X, Y, and Z, or versus the bull run. Like what stabilized the peg, and people, depending on where they're most invested, have different ideas. I'm beginning to wonder, though, if the stability fee is, in my opinion, the stability fee is the primary motivating factor. And I think that we're seeing some activity right now where people have been watching that stability fee creep up, and this bull run has given them the perfect opportunity to get out of a CDP that they don't want to be in anymore. And so the bull run opened the door to allow the stability fee to be more effective. Am I looking at this from a naive perspective, or does that make sense?
I mean, that makes total sense to me. It's a holistic equation, right? It's not like any one thing. This was kind of the point of that calculator that I had shared a while back, is there's an overall profitability equation. The expected increase of ETH price from where we are currently is one variable. The stability fee is another variable. And something that I didn't capture that is very hard for any of us to capture at the moment is the liquidity of DAI and the liquidity of ETH and the volatility of ETH in those time periods is also a complicating variable in terms of it changes the likelihood that you get knocked out of your CDP, and it changes the likelihood that you can realize the theoretical profits that you're making. So it's complex is the answer, but that's definitely a part of it.
Yeah, and the question also will be, once we have the DAI savings rate, will there be a corresponding effect? Because my humble opinion is the DSR will be a far more potent tool than the underlying, than the stability fee in terms of getting rid of outstanding supply. So where you were just outlining a moment ago that it's much easier to, that getting the price of DAI to get back up was more challenging than it was to let it fall back down. I would venture to bet we're going to be having a similar argument, but at the other side in 6 months.
I would agree with that. I think the DAI savings rate like fundamentally changes the economics and is a like economically more rich counterpart to the stability fee. The stability fee is kind of like a simple interest rate. It doesn't actually inherently necessarily have the effect that we would want it to, but the DAI savings rate is kind of like a bigger and better lever if you think about it that way.
It's a lever for the masses. I mean, the stability fee, people are willing to endure all sorts of pain because the underlying collateral can generate 40% return in 3 days. So if you had to pay 20% a year, that's not really so. It's just an annoyance right now. It's not a super motivation to close out your CDP. It's an annoying as hell if you don't, or if you're not one of the folks that are generating those kind of returns and you decided to buy a car with it. It can of course be annoying if you compare it to the market, but when you get to the underlying the DAI savings rate and the number of people globally that would be able to use it, it will be very potent.
Agreed.
What about, I don't know if it's been looked into, but not quite going back to the PID conversation, but you can have simple mechanisms like if DAI is 99 cents, then you can sort of oppose that off the peg so that printing it, you basically use up $1.01 debt denominated in DAI but you really only get a market value of 99 cents out of that. That basically instantly steals that penny of profit away from a CDP printer. So if they're off by 10 cents, then they're basically printing it. They're creating it at $1.10, but the market value would be 90 cents if the market value is 90 cents at that time.
Hey, sorry, just real quick. I don't want to necessarily change the topic, but I did think we kind of skipped over one item. Was regarding the current state of things and like how high the collateralization ratio is, and given the amount of DAI inventory that is sort of sitting with all the different traders that cashed out on ETH. Like, to me, that is a economically precarious moment, because what's potentially positive about the high collateralization ratio in that scenario is that people are confident in Maker, DAI is heavily backed. There's been all these beautiful graphics that people have tweeted out, how many, dollars there are to every DAI. But what I fear is that there's a significant collateralization ratio within the system because people fear a drop in ETH price and they don't necessarily want to get liquidated out. And so what I think, to me, that actually says is and this is where there was actually an earlier, like 4 or 5 weeks ago, conversation about what can we learn from the collateralization ratio. That could be, Cyrus, what you were kind of looking for in terms of how can we estimate how bullish people are, is kind of like a translated or an adjusted metric of the collateralization ratio in nominal dollar terms. So like sort of relative to ETH price, how much collateral is in the system. And maybe that's something that we can look at, because I think right now, actually, people are afraid of DAI price. Like they've seen the DAI price come up so much, they're afraid of it coming down a bit and getting liquidated. And so they've kept this massive buffer of collateral in the system.
Yeah, I would take the other side of that, which is saying that the reason why DAI was mentioning before about like the blended return, the reason why we only have one side, the stability fee right now. And if the DAI supply is decreasing, that means on a selfish level, CDP on a blended level is not returning 19.5% per year, right? But that also means to me, when you see an ETH underlying collateral accelerate and you have higher collateralization, if we were, and I'm discount the moment for what would happen to the DAI price for a moment, but if we reduce the stability fee today back down to 1%, just as a gross example, I think we would see DAI being minted like mad. I think the challenge is right now, the only CDPs that have significant exposure out now have whatever algorithm they've got that's generating a return that's blended at 19.5 or slightly lower. I think if we had the other side of the equation, the savings side, and we could have a way to control the price. That to me, that's the core issue right now, is what would happen if we set it down to 5. DAI would be minted like mad today, but the price would get degraded. And that's not what we want. We need that corresponding component. But if we had that, the outstanding DAI, in my opinion, you probably just add another 0 outstanding to it, or multiply by 3 or 4.
Vishesh, I have one interesting observation based on the spreadsheet that you provided. There was about 122 Ether being withdrawn from CDPs, and that's about 30 million in DAI, but the supply fell, I think, by about 4 or 5 million. So I'm questioning myself, why would people not repay their debt if they're withdrawing their collateral? Now, a theory that I have is that they might be migrating to other coins, such as Bitcoin. And the other theory is that these guys, I mean, they should repay their debt, right? Because they're paying interest on it. But there's one idea that these guys could be waiting for Ether to crash because it grew crazy. And I believe once it crashes, they might step back into Ether from the DAI they sit on. So we should have this positive effect, if you ask me, if this happens. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I had mentioned that earlier. I think like the amount of dye that's sitting out. Just one quick thing to note: the dye, like a lot of dye, was paid back in the last 24 hours. So that is happening, and that is reasonable. Like you lever up on ETH, you draw out a bunch of dye, ETH goes up a bunch, you pay back some of that debt. Like that makes sense. But that also says is that given the current stability fee right now, kind of what Matthew is saying is right, that like the overall profitability is probably about where it should be. And so maybe we can learn from that the stability fee, given a non-DSR environment, is about right. But to your point, like a lot of that dye, I think, is just kind of sitting there, and there's a huge buffer of collateral because people are kind of waiting to get back into ETH when ETH price goes down a bit from where it's at. So I think that is also a sentiment indicator, was my point, which is I think people are kind of, at least a significant portion of CDP holders are expecting ETH price to go down a little bit from here soon, or at least kind of hedging against that possibility. And so like for the capability to wait out that scenario, they are okay with paying the current stability fee as well, is another way to look at it.
Yeah, these are exactly my thoughts on that. I believe they will buy back into Ether because otherwise they would just repay their debt. So it's kind of a positive sign on the supply perspective. I mean, back perspective, if this happens.
But also, like, if we kind of think about what we're doing here, like, this is a use case for a stablecoin. Like, this is part of what DAI exists to do, is to have this kind of stable shelter, stable unit of account that people can kind of shift in and out of so that they can take advantage of or hedge against volatility. And then there is a certain percentage cost that people are willing to pay to have access to that opportunity. And then we're just kind of fine tuning what that cost is. But yeah, agree with Cyrus. This is going to be so much more complex with multiple assets.
All right, I want to jump in. We're at the hour-and-a-half mark, and I have a hard stop, so I'm going to need to stop recording. And but everybody's welcome to hang out and continue to chat if they like.
Unfortunately, I gotta get going too.
All right, I want to thank Vishesh and Matthew and Cyrus and all the rest for the great questions. Thank you, Josh and New Face. The audio video will be posted to the subreddit in a couple hours. We'll have a summary of all the most important points that were discussed. And once again, please continue the discussion there so we can continue the conversation. The executive vote, Aaron, is going live tomorrow at 4 a.m. or 4 p.m. UTC, so 9 PST. All right, thanks everyone. See you next week.